Hello and welcome to another episode of India and Global Left. If you are new to the show, please smash the subscribe button. Also consider becoming a YouTube member, a Patreon, or donate small amount given in the link in the description box. But the least you could do is to watch this show, like, share, and comment. Let me welcome our guest tonight, Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson. Colonel Wilkerson is a retired U.S. Army colonel and former Chief of Staff to Secretary of State Colin Powell. Colonel Wilkerson is a leading critique of U.S. militarism and imperial overreach. Colonel Wilkerson, welcome back to India and Global Left.
Good to be back with you.
If we could start with your assessment of the latest U.S. national security strategy document, what's your overall assessment of the document?
Long story, but let me give a little bit of background. In 2000, and then immediately after taking office in the umbrated transition process, George W. Bush administration said, essentially from its national security advisor, Condoleezza Rice, to Richard Haas, my boss at the policy planning staff at the State Department at the time, write the national security strategy. The president wants it, and he wants it fast. About 6 or 7 drafts later, drafts that I participated in the writing of, Dr. Rice refused our offering. She then handed it out to her own staff on the National Security Council. 6 or 7 months later, she didn't like that. All to say, she then contracted it out. The National Security Strategy of the United States in 2002, when it was finally published, was written by a contractor. Fast forward to today, there is no question in my mind that the administration sent that same kind of, probably right off the bat, order to the Heritage Foundation, and they wrote the strategy. So that's probably the provenance of it. And if you know anything about the Heritage Foundation, you know something about the national security strategy. Just as Project 2025 came out of them, and just as much of what Trump has been doing came out of them. What it says, in essence, is not what on the surface and politically for domestic consumption by the MAGA gang is intended. They, I'm sure, interpret it as we're coming home to the Western Hemisphere. We're going to do things in the Western Hemisphere. We're going to take care of our own territory, if you will. The announcement this morning, I think, that we are going to reclaim the oil in Venezuela because Venezuela stole it from us. If you can believe that, we actually tweeted that this morning in terms of our formal policy, is an indication of ramifying that with the American people that voted for Donald Trump and that still stay with him. So that's what the patina of the strategy is. But the essence of the strategy is no change at all, except for the fact that we are going to mind our P's and Q's, if you will, in our own hemisphere, apparently, in order to husband strength, build strength, help our allies like Japan, Korea, the Philippines, Australia, and so forth, to fight China, ultimately. That's what this strategy says. So there's no real change. The focus is still on China. It's not necessarily an inevitable focus of war, but it certainly smacks of that. I don't think Donald Trump, for example, wants a shooting war with China, nor does Xi Jinping want one with the American empire. But this is a very good recipe for getting there. And so it's disguised in the strategy, but it's really not much of a change.
My own reading was that there was a deep shift towards China as a central focus of U.S. national security. I mean, it's not a shift in terms of overall direction in which U.S. Foreign policy has been heading towards for at least a decade. But in terms of the security strategy document, it found clear expression. I wonder, what was your reading of the hawkish anti-China strategy in the document, and how do you square that up with the some of the spirit that was displayed in the Busan summit, which some analysts thought that this is an acceptance on part of the U.S. administration that China is now a uh, a power to contend with, and the U.S. cannot keep bullying it. How do you square both of them?
I think the reality has struck the Pentagon in particular, but also the White House, such as it is. I don't know if you saw the Vanity Fair piece that broke yesterday, I guess, that Chris Whipple did. Um, devas- Devastating expose that none other than Susie Wiles put on the White House in 11 interviews, um, hour or so each, as I understand it. And Chris Whipple is good at this. I used to use his book, The Gatekeepers, which is about, I think, 17 chiefs of staff in the White House. It's a very good book. It tells you what chiefs of staff do and what they did during the times they served their presidents. All of that is muddying the waters right now. But I think, in answer to your specific question, we are seriously talking to especially Japan, especially Korea, especially Australia, but others too, like the Philippines. And we are reinforcing with them the idea that with them, we can, in peacetime, if there's such a thing, surround China to the extent where she is so hamstrung by that surrounding that ultimately the same thing will happen to China as happened to the Soviet Union. I remember when Marshal Akameyev brought a map to then Admiral Corral, who was chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff at the time, and put the map on Corral's desk and showed it to him and said, "This is what you're doing to me." And he showed all the outposts around the Soviet Union. And then he showed a map of the United States, and there, of course, were no Soviet outposts around the United States. That's what we are showing our allies with regard to China. That's what we're showing members of our Congress when we take them on tours in the Pacific Theater, Indo-Pacific now. And that's a part of this strategy. And we like the fact that we've got a new prime minister in Japan who seems to be as bellicose as any we've had. Um, Korea's not quite as in the bag, if you will, but we do have unprecedented cooperation going on between Tokyo and Seoul now. That's my 35, 40 years of my career was trying to affect that kind of coordination in various ways, even at the State Department with policy planning talks. But now it seems to be happening pretty much on the ground. That's interesting because we didn't think it ever would. The Philippines and Australia are there. I don't know how much they add to the equation, but they're there. And that's it. We're going to surround China. We're going to do to it the same thing we did to the Soviet Union, make it so impossible for China to operate that they have to come to some sort of modus vivendi with us, if not war. Now, that's all belied by the fact, and this is part of the strategy too, that China is now the chief trade partner for every country in South America, which is half of the Western Hemisphere. so, and the new, not so new now, but the new leader in Canada has said, "I'm changing everything Canada has done in the past. We are no longer going to be reliant on the United States. In fact, we're going to cut ties with the United States." And he started taking concrete actions to do that. So while we're professing this attention to our own hemisphere in order to husband power and fight the ultimate enemy, China, either in a cold war or a hot war, um, the hemisphere is disintegrating all around us. And this statement this morning that came out of the White House is a perfect example of that, essentially claiming Venezuela's oil and saying that we now have the greatest armada that's ever steamed the oceans in the Western Hemisphere, uh, of confronting Venezuela, confronting Maduro, and we want our oil back. What they mean is beyond interpretation, as far as I'm concerned. We want our oil back, and we're going to get it back tanker by tanker, ship by ship, effort by effort, and we're going to get it back by force if necessary. So there you have it.
One of the things that struck me was that the economic hawks, by economic hawks, I'm referring to the trade hawks basically, but it's a little bit deceptive because they are also
Say it.
talking about
Say it.
investment.
Say Blackwater.
Yes, they have been going absolutely berserk against almost any nations, and they are people like Peter Navarro and others, even Zimishan Greer, the U.S. trade representative, even I would say Scott Bazin, even though his language is a little bit reserved. They have been trying to extract the best from almost anyone, and that also includes quote unquote traditional allies, but also sometimes not so traditional, but countries like India. So that's one set of developments we have seen over the year. And on the other side, from the security framework, we are still seeing the old framework of ganging up allies against China. So there you see in the security document still discussing about ganging up from Japan to the Philippines against, including Taiwan, against the first island chain. It also talks about India in a very different way than what Peter Navarro would do, effectively the theory, repeating the theory that India can be used to counter China. How do you square these two kind of contradictions that I see within the U.S. administration?
I don't necessarily see any contradictions that matter because the entire concept is void the moment it's cast the way they cast it. And I'm not sure that any kind of concept of taking China on wouldn't be that way in any event. And here's what I mean by that. The number one economy in the world now is China. There is absolutely no question in sane people's minds, whether they be the Davos crowd, Blackwater alone, Vanguard, State Group, any of the big companies that manage the world's assets, if you will. Everyone knows that China is the number one economy in the world. We continue to say different things about it, but I'm sorry, they are in every factor that counts. They're the number one economy in the world. We have compelled a rapidly improving economy in many respects, made to do so by force majeure, if you will, by the fact that they're at war in Ukraine, in Russia. We have also compelled the two countries, Russia and China, to form at least a tacit alliance. It's an alliance that right now apparently is not very worried, concerned, certainly not deeply concerned. And I could go into that in detail because I've tracked this for a long time about the fact that China is more or less developing those regions in Russia that we used to call, when it was the Soviet Union, the Far Eastern TVD, the Far Eastern Theater. Russia has not the inclination nor the means to go out there and do much, so China's doing it. China is actually the development agency for the Far East, minus Vladivostok maybe and Kamchatka, for Russia. So this is a tight group we've created. And I think you could almost, in a sense, add India to that group, increasingly so if we continue the current policies. So here you've got three, at least two, three of the biggest and most powerful countries in the world lining up against the empire. And they're lining up against the empire with different speeds, if you will, different velocities, and different feelings, I'm sure, about whether or not they've made the right move going down that hierarchy. Turkey has looked at it. Turkey is, I think, on the verge of absolutely unanchoring and finally doing the damage that's irreparable to NATO in its southern flank, because Erdogan is probably, or his follow on, is probably going to take Turkey out of NATO. I don't think Turkey is still of a mind to confront, in, as it were, Central Asia, China's inexorable movement to the West. but it is going to try and join it, I think, or it's going to establish neutrality. So we have an entirely different world aboarding, and we have leaders in Washington who are either by intellectual incapacity, historical ignorance, or intent, and I don't know which it is, playing the empire into its demise as surely as if they were Nero playing on his violin while Rome burned. It's insane as far as I'm concerned. I almost feel like from time to time there is agency here. And what I mean by that is we have a president and certain key members of his administration who believe that the way to save America is to destroy her. And that's a very dangerous concept in my mind. But they're doing a really remarkable job of moving along execution of that concept. Um, all to say, China's winning, we're losing. India and Turkey are trying to figure out just how fast it's going to happen and to which side they should go or be neutral. And 60% of the rest of the world is watching it and, in some respects, cheering.
On Turkey, I'm glad you made that still kind of ambiguous position, the way one can think about India, even though in India's case the recent tilt has been clearly towards, I mean, it has always been very close to Russia, but we've seen recent tilt towards China, or at least the realization that it is not worth fighting against China in the instigation of the United States, and also the interest of the divergent interest of India and China in Asia are very different from the larger Cold War or hot war, whatever it may be in East Asia that China is very worried about. I wanted to ask you about Turkey, since you made that comment about its likelihood of joining China. There is a theory that Turkey might be willing to join the larger attempt made by the US, sometimes called as the Abraham Accord, but in its essence, the larger, not, apart from the geopolitical side of it, it's the investment and infrastructure project that the West floats, never mind if it is capable or not, as an alternative to the China-led efforts in the region. And particular mention is to bring Azerbaijan and Armenia in South Caucasus away from the influence of Russia. I wonder what your thoughts are about that theory.
Interestingly enough, there are some people in the Pentagon right now with whom I've had some conversation who look at the situation with respect to China and India as inevitably fracturing. That is to say, there is no love lost between Delhi and Beijing. And they're waiting for that to happen. And I would imagine they're probably working with their various friends in the government to see if they can't make that happen. I think they have a rather jaundiced view of the relationship based on the openings that the military, in particular. One reason we changed the name of the combatant command to the Indo-Pacific, with the Indian Navy in particular, but the Indian military in general, and not so much with Delhi's blessing, but with their acquiescence, came fairly close together, especially the navies. And the United States found that really terrific, and that's one reason it changed its combatant command name to encompass that concept, that it was the Indian Ocean and the Pacific, and okay, by the way, open parentheses, the Indian Navy is pretty powerful in that body of water, and we've got them on our side. I think that's a false impression. Whether you parse it in terms of the civilians in Delhi and how they really feel about this, or whether you parse it in terms of the Indian Navy putting all of its money in that basket and not necessarily being a good basket to put it in. All of that to say that I don't think we're going to be able to, and I wouldn't have said this 20 years ago when people like Richard Boucher and Evan Feigenbaum were making constant trips to Delhi. to work on the nuclear situation and to create a new situation for India and the United States with regard to nuclear sharing. But I think it's gone afoul, and it went afoul of Biden and then the Trump administration. Other things too, but I don't think India has any other place to go than a studied neutrality or more and more towards the new power structure that's forming. It has a choice of being a member of that power structure in good standing or standing off and watching it from a position of neutrality and going to neither side. But at that time, they're watching the United States collapse. I think that's a fair appraisal of where we're going. If you look at the economic situation, if you look at the leadership, if you look at what we're doing in our own hemisphere, you look at some of the things we're doing to negate the entire history of the imperial outreach since 1945, which was somewhat benign and benign mostly under its approval of and oftentimes flawed, but nonetheless enforcement of international law and international norms, the so-called international order. We no longer believe in any of that. We've done the best job of destroying it. All to say that I think when this power struggle, this power shift is more upon us and our own demise is accompanying that, particularly physically, economically, all the world, as it were, is going to jump on the other stage in various different ways. But they're going to jump on that stage because that's where the bread's going to be buttered. I'm speaking to a group in Tbilisi right after this. And one of the things I'm going to tell them is you have the right party in power right now. And you should have parties in power for the foreseeable future who have the same view as they, by which I mean you don't make an enemy of Russia. And you damn sure don't make an enemy of China. Instead, you sit upon this network of railroads and roads and this flow of power from the west to the east, inevitable, and you make money off of it. That's your position. That's the Caucasus. Don't take sides with anybody. Don't take sides with the EU, certainly not those demented people in Brussels. Don't take sides with the empire because the empire is collapsing and you could get sucked down in the vacuum. And you'll make Russia angry and they'll do what they did to you before when they poured into your country and took a little bit. So that's my advice to them. That would be my advice to anyone lying in the path of this inexorable power shift and the demise of the American empire. Don't get caught in it. Watch it from the periphery if you want. Make money off of it and ensure that you are lined up with the powers to be and continue to make money and don't make a lot of noise for those powers. Don't make yourself an impediment to them. That may sound cold, but I think that's pretty rational, and that's the way the world's going.
We had a name. We used to had a name for this. It was called the non-aligned movement in the 50s, 60s, and the 70s.
77 countries, I think, at one point.
Yes, and that was very powerful, at least in its ideological influence, because these were mostly member states came off the bat of decolonization, and the Cold War was moving at a great pace, and many of these countries realized that it's not in our interest to join either of the groups full blown unless some of them were caught in the crossroads of history and they had no other ways but to choose one over others.
That's a good way to put it.
Yes. But talking about neutrality, and as you have explained, that a lot of countries are moving towards that, whether you call it neutrality, but to avoid getting sucked into one side of this big power game, if you like. Ukraine moved quite in a different direction 10 years ago, from neutrality towards belligerence. There are peace plans now. I wonder whether you even think of them as peace plans, but there are these points being floated at the same time when the war is raging in the front. And my reading is that the balance of evidence suggests that it has been rapidly shifting towards Russia's favor at the front. Where is this heading towards? And what is your assessment of the peace plan? Is it a genuine peace plan coming out of Washington, or is it a trick to save a little bit of Ukraine that the West or the US would still like to use against Russia?
That's a good question. I think that the tactical parameters of it right now are such that I would think that the three powers in the EU that matter, Britain, France, and Germany, would be awakening to the fact that they are themselves contributing not only to the destruction of NATO, it was moribund anyway. It had some place to go in out of area operations and things like that, but that proved a very bad move. So it's moribund, but to have it fall apart as precipitously as it I think is going to is testimony to their strategic ignorance or strategic idiocy. And when you talk about Turkey unanchoring the southern flank, for example, that's going way too far. And then in terms of stupidity, and then you look at the fact that Russia now, because of the Europeans' obdurance, Russia is probably going to own the north shore of the Black Sea before this is over completely, from Odessa to Sevastopol, all the way to the other port to the east of that. That's a strategic change of first order, certainly for the empire, but also for Europe. And when you look at what they're doing now, and I think I never can remember his name, Lord Robert Skidelsky, who posits in a recent piece that the reason Starmer, Macron, and Merz are doing what they're doing is because they see the only way to increase spending in their countries is to strive for this 5% of GDP that Trump demanded they do in order to keep NATO from going moribund. And not for NATO necessarily, but to revive their own economies. And Germany's leading the way. One of the pieces that I don't think Lord Robert cited it, but I happened to read it about the same time I read his piece. The CEO of Rheinmetall in Germany, making such grandiose claims that Rheinmetall would probably one day outdo Lockheed Martin, the premier death merchant in the world, belonging, of course, to the empire. That's Rheinmetall, and the article was accompanied by pictures of howitzers and tanks and other things rolling off the production line in Germany. This is how, do we want to go back to 1936, 1937? This is how they plan on rescuing, Merz plans on rescuing Germany's economy by defense spending. And Macron and Starmer seem to have caught on to that and seem to want to adopt that same course. This is dangerous. This is extremely dangerous. But they don't realize that what they're doing has been caused by their own idiocy, their own stupidity, their own strategic stupidity in particular. Trying to make Ukraine a member of NATO, the ultimate member of NATO, make Ukraine that which probed the heart of Russia daily, 24/7, with equipment and NATO arms and troops pouring in. And now they're talking about sending troops again into Ukraine, the Europeans, because they're so frustrated with what Trump is doing. They're insane. And to the deal, Trump has backed up a little bit, but I don't think he's going to back up any much further if he backs up at all, because he understands now. I think he's understood since Alaska, but he's had the European leaders probing him almost on a weekly basis, trying to stop him. And he's had others too, even in his own administration, people like Marco Rubio and Lindsey Graham and so forth. He wants to stop this war, and he wants to stop it, and he wants to reestablish good relations with Moscow, mostly for money purposes. So it's going to happen. And these European leaders are going to get caught in the mess. But at the same time, they are in an almost Clausewitzian fashion creating a dynamic in this war that might force Putin or persuade him that he needs to do more than he's doing presently. And that's not a good momentum to have started, not at all. Um, I would say right now, Putin is probably convinced that there's a 60 or 65% chance that he's going to have to fight NATO ultimately. And I think he realizes that that has all kinds of ramifications that aren't good for anyone, including him, not least of which is nuclear weapons use. So that's the disaster that Europe is dragging this war into, which should have been settled a long time ago. And it should have been settled largely on Russia's demands because we, the empire, NATO, its vassal, Brussels, the EU, were all responsible for this war. Not Russia, not the special military operation, we. And that's not to praise Putin or to excuse Putin. It's just to point out reality that they don't realize. And this reality may yet eat their lunch. I go back to the Spanish Civil War and how Hitler tested his weapons and his systems and so forth in Spain before he undertook the more grandiose schemes that he did in 1939, 1940, and so forth. And I see a lot of similarities between what Ukraine is doing and what Hitler did. Only I don't see anybody with the brains that Hitler had at the time, anyway, behind it. It's just chaos for chaos's sake, but chaos may produce something they didn't. Be careful what you wish for; you might get it that they didn't want. One of the things they might not want, and that might happen, is a resurgent in very powerful ways, Germany. I remember when we were talking, these thoughts came back to me the other day when I was talking in another interview about this. When we were talking to Helmut Kohl and Francois Mitterrand about the reunification of Germany, its retention in NATO, and to Helmut Kohl's utter surprise, in a favorable way. And he was very alarmed at what that might mean to Moscow, even with Gorbachev and Shevardnadze there, not there in the talks, but in Moscow, and showing a very different face. He's very worried, and he had a right to be worried. He had a right to be worried because he knew he was enough of a historian to know, and Francois Mitterrand too. And their feet was in, as Powell used to say, their feet was in the war. They had actually been alive during the war, maybe 12 or 13 years old, but they were alive. And Kohl was very worried about what that would do. Not just the $80 billion US they told him reunification would cost. It wound up costing about twice that. And the relocation of Bonn to Berlin, very much in favor of that. I mean, what German wouldn't be? But he understood history, as did Francois Mitterrand. And even, I will say, Maggie Thatcher and John Major in London understood history. And this conversation was a very potent, powerful conversation. Taught me some things about the history of the war and Europe's feelings and so forth, too, that I felt I knew beforehand from a static historical perspective, but not viscerally listening to people talk about it. And that's been discarded. That's been discarded. No one cares about that anymore. No one knows about it anymore. No one does history anymore in Europe or the United States. There's a few academics that do, but none of these leaders do. These are perilous things to be thinking about in the way they're thinking about it. For example, Germany trying to resurrect its now moribund economy on defense spending. That has its own dynamic. It has its own reality. And as Helmut Kohl was very aware of, Germany reunited has its own reality.
It's very interesting that these architects, Macron, Starmer, but also his predecessors, the Blair, the neoliberal Blair, these were the architects of imposing neoliberalism on Europe. They have been peddling this narrative of going to the extremes to save credit worthiness of private creditors. effectively this idea that any kind of state spending is to the detriment of the welfare of the people. And now they are using the levers of state spending to ramp up the economy. I mean, they are not the believers of at least Keynesianism, for God's sake. I mean, you were neoliberals, at least stay true to your ideology to save us from the wars. If not, you can do a little bit of welfare. But I wanted to come to
It shows what versatile politicians they are.
absolutely. I wanted to come to something you said about coal and those years, the early years of German reunification and the end of the Cold War, if you like. The idea that NATO is uh, dangerous to Central Europe and East Europe was pretty much there. But with years, that has been completely, if not completely, but significantly erased, because this was also the 90s was the unipolar moment and the rise of the neocons. And all what they did was that they, if they gradually and slowly shifted Europe to this idea that NATO expansion is the only way to ensure our security against an ever-ending Russia. And I wanted to have your thoughts on whether you see the difference between the United States and Europe today on the question of Russia as something fundamental, but by which I mean that there are people in the United States who think that our main enemy is now China, and so we should pivot away from Eurasia, which is in contrary to what many of these leaders in Europe think of, who are still stuck in this idea that Russia is ever expanding and we need to guard against it. Um, is the difference something of that sort, or is it primarily very trivial about who would spend more or who would subsidize whose public more to pay the fat defense contractors in Washington? I mean, in the United States, is that the difference, or is it a fundamental shift between the US and Europe?
I think if you look at it very, very closely, first of all, we missed an enormous opportunity in the early 90s. And we had a president who was not inclined as sharply and strongly and powerfully as he probably should have been, but nonetheless, he was inclined. We missed an opportunity to, in essence, bring Russia into Europe, negate NATO entirely by bringing Russia into NATO. and and then I think you would have had an attenuation of this idea that developed afterwards with Bill Clinton and subsequent presidents, that out of area operations ultimately aimed at NATO joining the empire in defeating China and maybe even Russia along the way, although at that time Russia was Boris Yeltsin in a drunken stupor, would be a really brilliant strategy. So what we did in 1993 by unelecting George H.W. Bush was a volte-face of huge strategic proportions. We essentially said, as Germany, and this was a great article I read the other day, Germany has made Staatsräson, raison d'etat, love of Israel. And it's a psychoanalytical concept with the Germans. We have done the same thing now in a very short period of time and with far less motivation than the Germans had. After all, there was the Holocaust with Russia. Russophobia is a permanent fixture in domestic America now. People hate Russia. We've done a wonderful job to create that image and make it a reality. That's not everyone, of course, but it's enough people to concern you. It is raison d'etat for Americans now to hate Russia. So that's a huge transition we've made, and how you would back up from that seems to me to be a real imponderable step. But Trump's trying. to his credit, as far as I'm concerned, he's trying. Now, his credit, I think, is the right word to use. He misses that $300 billion plus in trade, and he wants it back. And he sees that the vastness of Russia might mean that there are all manner of things in Russia that we don't even know about. That's one reason the Chinese are doing what they're doing out in the Far Eastern TVD. There's all kinds of product out there, if you will, from gas and oil to rare earth metals to you name it, that might be discovered that would make Russia even more powerful than it already is. So Trump has good instincts there, I think. But he's up against, as you were suggesting, he's up against this Russophobia in the United States, and he's up against the people in the United States who, not necessarily because they hate Russians, Marco Rubio comes to mind immediately, Secretary of State, National Security Advisor, but want to keep it going. And what you have to conclude, I think, what I conclude from looking at that period from roughly the end of the Cold War, whether you want to put it in 89, 90, 91, or 92, the wall coming down, whatever is your trademark, and then start with William Jefferson Clinton in the disaster policy, as I call it. If you look at it closely, I think it's simple enough to say we wanted a continuation of the Cold War. When I say we, I'm talking about this group. Call it the people behind the shadows, call it the billionaires, call it the Marco Rubios, call it the whomevers. I don't think Donald Trump's in this group. Thank God. But they wanted the continuation of the Cold War, and they saw initially China as being that which would be focused on to create that environment. And then all of a sudden, Ukraine fell in their lap and Russia fell in their lap. And so now we have a double pronged Cold War going on, one with Russia that's hot right now through proxy, and one with China that could get hot at any moment. But we don't want it to, we say, but we are going to prepare for it. And you know, and I know that preparation for war sometimes breeds war. And that's what I'm significantly worried about with this kind of strategy we just put out and what we're doing in Venezuela and elsewhere. Um, it doesn't look good for the empire, in my view. It doesn't look good at all. And part of the reason is, as I just described inexpertly, started in the movement of a president who understood the world quite well, probably the most experienced president since Dwight Eisenhower, and into a bunch of novices who didn't know what they were doing. And that's all we've had, including Barack Obama.
We have about 10 minutes, so I guess we can squeeze in a couple of questions. Uh, Talking about German support to the Zionist, I, I wanted to have your thoughts on your reading about Israel Palestine since the ceasefire or the partial ceasefire on October 10th and the recent UNSC resolution, which effectively erased within the UN frameworks the reality like occupation, Palestinian statehood, by making these discussions about uh, demilitarization of Hamas, about um, exchanging of dead or alive prisoners, and so on, while they're still occupying and while uh, Israeli leaders are very clear that they are not going to allow Palestinian statehood at any cost. What is your reading about what has happened for the Palestinian freedom movement since October 10?
First of all, I think Antonio Guterres should hide his head in shame, not that he had the courage or the ability to change what happened. He could have at least made different statements about what happened, because what he did was preside over a UN Security Council resolution that, in effect, reintroduced rank colonialism in the Levant. He blessed the colonial powers dealing with Israel and the Palestinians. And I'm talking about the entire array from Lebanon to Syria to the West Bank to East Jerusalem, you name it, what else might come up. They blessed it. and said, that's the future, and we are going to internationalize and sanctify what you're doing to the Palestinians. That's what he did. And Netanyahu is the only one that's been clarion clear about this behind the scenes in Hebrew mostly, but sometimes in English. And he's not stopped the killing. He's not stopped the slaughter. And yet he's got a counter going on that it features everything from, oh, haven't you seen all the food trucks come in? Haven't you seen all the relief we're giving? Haven't you seen all we're doing? Oh, by the way, I killed 30 in the West Bank yesterday. Or I'm doing the same thing in Syria. We have blessed this unconscionable genocide and put international markers on it to say, continue, please, maybe at a slightly slower pace, and with just maybe a fewer casualties on a daily basis and a few less bombs dropped and so forth, but continue. And oh, by the way, if you want to take out Iran, feel free to take a sideshow anytime you want to. He made a speech yesterday on that. And I think he's still intent on doing that. His plea was based on the incredible drought that Iran's having in the southern portion of the country. And he used that to plead to the Iranian people to allow Israel to come in and put its expertise at osmosis and water purification and everything else. Greatest country in the world in doing this, and just let us in and we'll do all this. This man is the closest thing to a Svengali on the face of the earth. That he has the time to dream up all these different plots and these different appeals is astonishing. I have to give him credit for that. But it's a mess. And it is not going to benefit at all the Palestinians. Hamas has sensed this, I think. Their core leadership right now is probably not going to agree to any kind of disarmament proposal, not going to agree to any kind of disbanding proposal, and is going to keep their powder dry and their, muscles wet. They're going to be the same they've been all along, protesting an illegal occupation. Whether or not it's going to be in any way, fashion, or form ultimately beneficial to the Palestinians remains to be seen. But I don't think that Netanyahu's accomplished his primary strategic goal, which was the elimination of Hamas, even though he has professed it on multiple occasions that it has happened or is happening. And all we've done is internationalize his efforts. Unconscionable, in my view.
Demilitarizing of decommissioning of large weapons um, by Hamas would mean giving up the anti-colonial resistance, which is not
And
going to
I
happen.
don't know what they mean by large weapons, because
Yeah, I mean they are large. It's yeah.
they don't have
That's
any
why I was
F-16s,
hesitant to use.
F-15s.
Yeah, but that was used during those negotiations with the mediators,
Yeah,
by which I assume that they are referring to rocket launchers. Uh,
that's all I can assume too, and maybe
yeah.
an occasional improvised explosive device, which have become real killers like they were in Iraq and Afghanistan.
Uh-huh.
And that's taking Israeli munitions and fashioning them into
Right.
IEDs.
And decommission of small weapons would mean handing over Gaza to gangs, some of which have been actually propped up by the Zionist entity and in cahoots with the Americans.
Or even worse, handing it over to Mahmoud Abbas and the
Right.
Palestinian Authority.
I wanted to end by asking you a final question on Venezuela, given our last discussion with you reached to about 117,000 viewers on our main channel, and we also have 7 or 8 mirror channels, so it must have reached to, I don't know, like 300,000 people. There was a full show on Venezuela, but if you could just update us on the latest developments in the Caribbean and the new Monroe Doctrine. What does the U.S. foreign policy in the region suggest, and what are the latest developments?
Well, on the Monroe Doctrine, Trump was a day late and a dollar short because Putin was already paying him back in his own coin. when he sent Admiral Gorshkov to frigate the Havana along with a nuclear powered submarine. And now he's sending all manner of things to include, we think, missiles capable of taking out an aircraft carrier like the Jerry Ford to Venezuela. So the Monroe Doctrine is dead, and Putin has proven it dead. One wonders if he's going to do anything more in our face, like deploy Poseidon or something like that in the Caribbean. But nonetheless, the Monroe Doctrine is dead. I'm not sure we have enough people in the government smart enough to realize that, but it is dead. Now, what's happening is Trump is putting an armada plus, and probably I would guess right now close to 20% of Marine, Naval, some Army, and other assets, certainly Special Operations Command in quantity. This is why the Admiral in Southern Command, Admiral Hulsey, is stepping down. One of the reasons, because Special Operations Command is operating in his area of responsibility, and he doesn't know what they're doing half the time. And this is a real problem for the U.S. military. We've gotten to the point where Special Operations Command takes over, and that's what's happening. No telling how many of them are actually on Venezuelan soil right now, doing whatever they can. So we have a armada, and this morning, the word out of the White House in that typical fashion, the tweets or whatever they call them, is that Venezuela stole America's oil. The first question you ask yourself is, what the hell does that mean? We are going to take it back. And the armada is down there to do it. So what we're saying in essence is you surrender those 300 billion barrels of proven reserve to us for manipulation, whatever, by the multinationals we choose, whatever. Charles Koch will refine your heavy sulfur content oil in Texas and Oklahoma, thank you very much, and make millions, if not billions. Or else we're going to essentially invade and take it. That's what it looks like to me. I mean, that's sort of the threat. Now, one never knows about these incredibly direct things that come out of the White House like this. But there it is. That's the challenge to Maduro right now. I thought they were talking on the phone. I thought Trump and Maduro were actually talking. And Maduro was willing to, and I have this from sources I trust, he was willing to go back to Hugo Chavez's cooperation and even beyond that, because he realized if he brought the multinationals back in, certain ones of them, that he would refurbish what is really a decrepit oil infrastructure in Venezuela, which is a real part of their economic problems. So it would be a win-win for both, if you will. And both would, Trump particularly would trump his success, and Maduro could point to the economy and say, nah, look, it's better. That would be I would call that a win-win, but I don't think so now.
Rubio can't allow that.
I think you're right. Rubio, the only portfolio Rubio has is this. He's not in Ukraine. He's not in the Levant. He's not doing anything else. I can't even tell what he's doing as national security advisor, if anything. So all Rubio's got to do is play around in Latin America. So Trump is like, okay, this is your SOP. I keep going back to what Tucker Carlson ostensibly told Trump when he was selecting his vice presidential candidate for the elections. And he said he was thinking about Rubio, and Tucker Carlson said, don't pick him, they'll assassinate him. Because the neocons want to get to Rubio being president so badly. There's probably some validity in that statement. So to a certain extent, I think Trump probably wants to keep Rubio at arm's length, and one way to do it is bury him in Venezuela.
We'll leave it there, Colonel Wilkerson. This was a fascinating conversation, as always. Thank you so much for your time.
Hi, my name is Ayushman. I, along with Jyotisman, have started this platform. In the last 2 years, we have tried to build content for the left and progressive forces. we have interviewed economists, historians, political commentators, and activists so far. If you have liked our content so far and want us to build an archive for the left, I have two requests for you. Please do consider donating for the cause. Link is in the description below. Also, if you are not able to do so, don't feel sad. You can always like our videos and share our videos to your comrades. Finally, don't forget to hit the subscribe button.